So we Americans call this conflict the Second World War. If you go to Russia today, they do not call this the Second World War. They call this the Great Patriotic War. When Hitler invaded the Soviet Union in June of 1941, it ended up being a catastrophe for the Soviet Union. And in order for the Soviet Union to be saved, it couldn't just be the military. Absolutely everybody capable of fighting would have to fight. Nobody was allowed to escape. Nobody was allowed to run. This was all-out total war, and absolutely everybody in the Soviet Union participated. The Soviets would, of course, win this conflict, but at an astronomical cost. Look at these deaths. No country in the history of humanity has had to suffer like the Soviets suffered during the Great Patriotic War. So here, I'm going to daringly posit a thesis about the war in Europe. As we look at this image right here of Americans getting out of their Higgins boat to go to the beaches of Normandy during D-Day in June 6th of 1944. I'm going to say this with the utmost respect to the Americans and our Western allies as we fought to liberate Western Europe from the Nazis and North Africa from the Nazis from 1942 to 1945. I say this with the utmost respect for all of those people. The Western Front didn't matter. This war is going to be won and lost on the Eastern Front. The very fact that these Americans are getting off this Higgins boat right now and they are able to successfully take northern France from the Nazis was because of the Soviets and what they had done on the Eastern Front. They had totally depleted the Nazi army of their fighting strength. Everybody who fought on the Western Front was incredibly heroic and courageous, but we all need to thank the Soviets for have really defeating the Nazis on the Eastern Front between 1941 and 1945. All right, let's go to that. When the Eastern Front erupted in June of 41, there are two conflicting ideas: Nazism versus communism. This final showdown will determine the rest of the 20th century. Hitler is going after the Soviet Union because he's a racist. He looks down upon the Russian people as lowly Slavs who don't know how to fight. He's a racist, and he's very optimistic given the weakness of the Soviet Union and Finland. Because of the purges throughout the 1930s, Stalin has knocked the legs out of his own Red Army. So Hitler plans the largest invasion in world history. Now, when I was in high school and I was taught about Operation Barbarossa, which is Hitler's plan of attack against the Soviet Union beginning of June of 1941, I was taught that this was Hitler's biggest mistake. If he had never attacked the Soviet Union, that he would have won World War II. Stalin had absolutely no plans to betray the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Now, whereas that may be true, Hitler also could have won Operation Barbarossa. The irony of all this is this: Hitler's attacking the Russians because he wants their land and because he's a racist. But Hitler's going to lose Operation Barbarossa really for two reasons. One, he doesn't know how to retreat. He refuses to listen to his commanders when they say, hey, we should pull back. He's like, no, we never pull back. And then two, because of his racist policies. Had Hitler not been a racist, millions of people in Eastern Europe would have joined with the Nazis to attack the Soviets because there were a lot of people who hated the Soviets. Like, for example, and in particular, the Ukrainians. They hated the Soviets. Most of them anyway. 5 million of them died in collectivization policies. They're going to look upon the Nazis as their liberators, but the Nazis are going to implement their racist policies against the Ukrainians, who they see as Slavs and as people who need to be enslaved. Poor Ukraine. But here it is, the largest military invasion in world history. The Nazis are going to line up 2 million men along a battlefront that is 1,800 miles long. Guys, this would be like if the United States tried to invade Canada and we lined up 2 million soldiers along the American-Canadian border, which is also about 1,800 miles long. This is a huge invasion. The Soviets, of course, noticed it. The great commander of the Red Army, Gregory Zhukov, said, let's strike them first. Stalin said, no, I don't believe the Nazis will ever strike me, no matter what his intelligence is telling him. But it begins in June 1941. Here comes the Nazi blitzkrieg, and they drive in, conquering approximately 200 miles per week, capturing and killing Soviets literally by the hundreds of thousands. Intelligence of this reaches the United States of America, where our Secretary of the Navy predicts that the Soviet Union will fall to the Nazis in 6 weeks. Stalin was stunned that Hitler would pull this. I mean, but what did he think? Was he really expecting to trust Hitler? So secretively, Stalin sent an ambassador to Hitler to try to sue for peace in the summer of 1941, within a month of this Nazi attack on the Soviet Union. But this particular ambassador was turned away, comes back to Stalin, says Hitler says no deal. Stalin calls this individual a traitor and sentences him to 15 years of hard labor in Siberia. For Hitler, he calls this a war of annihilation. The Slavic people are a lowly race. They deserve to be enslaved. There will be no working cooperatively with them. Their lands will be taken. Germans will have what he calls Lebensraum, or living space. Germans will have the vast farmlands of Eastern Europe for their own. So, as the Nazis go into Eastern Europe, one by one they capture communist officials of each town, commissars, hang them up and leave them hanging as an example of what they will do to the communists. Now, how did the Nazis do this in good conscience? Essentially, they'd been brainwashed and this goes all the way back to Mussolini. They'd been brainwashed that communists were the scourge of the East who were destroying civilization. By killing these men, by celebrating the killing of these men, they are saving humanity. The Nazis had conquered so much so quickly that literally they had hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers rounded up into improvised POW camps. These camps would literally just be fenced off in a field like you see here. And that was it. That was it. They just left them there. Nothing to eat, just exposed to the elements and each other. Some Nazi soldiers thought it was funny to take a piece of bread and throw it in the camps, watch the men fight for it. They compared it to feeding fish in a pond. Needless to say, there was murder, cannibalism. I can't imagine being caught in one of these Nazi POW camps. One of the individuals that was caught was Stalin's own son, Yakov Chugashvili. Tried to appeal to the Nazi commanders, I'm Stalin's son. Please, you can bargain me a way to maybe get some Nazi POWs back. This was reported to Stalin, and Stalin said, I don't have a son. Later on, Yakov Chugashvili tried to make a run for it, was gunned down. If you were a Nazi and you were captured by the Soviets, they just tortured you in terrible, terrible ways. Most Nazis just gave up and committed suicide. Hitler was thrilled by the advance of the Nazi army. It's incredible how fast they're moving. And at this rate, it seems like the Soviet Union will collapse by the end of 1941. And by 1942, Hitler will control all of Europe, except for the British Isles. And then he can turn his attention back to them. But there was a problem. Eastern Europe simply didn't have the same infrastructure as Germany. They didn't have things like paved roads. Nazis couldn't move their supply lines fast enough, so their army could move quick. They could conquer quick. But they're having difficulty moving other equipment eastwards into the captured and conquered Soviet Union. One of the great victories before the end of 1941 was the capture of the Ukrainian capital of Kiev, the largest military encirclement in history. It's a rather bizarre battle. So Stalin did not want to see Kiev fall, so he sends 1 million soldiers into Kiev. He doesn't have the resources to supply these soldiers. There's literally 1 rifle for every 5 men. Commanders beg for a retreat. These men are going to be sacrificed. This is nothing. They don't have they don't have the material to fight the Nazis. The Nazis go in, and within 2 weeks, they capture over 500,000 Soviets. Stalin thinks he can capture these Nazis, so he sends the Red Army out to encircle the town of Kiev, and they do. The Nazis are caught inside, but Here comes another Nazi army to encircle the encirclement. And there's nothing the Red Army can do. They're totally surrounded by the Nazis. There is nothing they can do. And what the Nazi soldiers saw astounded them. Here were Russian soldiers with no guns, and they just came charging at them. Literally this berserking suicide rush. So Nazis would gun them down. So they would, fire their machine guns into the charging men. And so the men would fall down. Some of these men hadn't been hit, but they'd fall down. They'd play dead. Wait for the Nazis come and check on them and then grab them and try to stab them. Nazis just thought, these guys are nuts. The Nazis could always rely on their military machinery. Soviets were just 100% fighting spirit. So as the Nazi army advanced, they had 3 principal cities that they were trying to capture. The first is in the north, Leningrad. Leningrad, previously Petrograd, previously and currently St. Petersburg, the largest city in the Soviet Union. At the end of 1941, the Nazis have completely surrounded the city of Leningrad, and the Siege of Leningrad begins. This, along with the Battle of Stalingrad, is considered to be the bloodiest battle of all time ever. There's going to be over 3 million casualties in this conflict alone. The siege, as you see here, lasts 900 days from 1941 to 1944. A couple things I want you to notice on this map. First of all, it's a German map. The Finns. So you see the Finnish army up there. I mean, go figure, the Finns are going to join sides with the Nazis after the Winter War. So they're playing an active role in this conflict. But then also look up where I wrote over the map 900 days, Siege of Leningrad, 41 to 44. And behind it you see the Ladoga Sea. Hopefully you remember drawing this Ladoga Sea on your map that you made in August. The Ladoga Sea will play an important role in this battle, the Siege of Leningrad. The people of Leningrad completely cut off from all supplies coming into Leningrad. They're going to be starved out, and starvation over the course of 3 years is really what defines the Siege of Leningrad. Small bits of food were rationed. There's horrible, horrible images that come out of the Siege of Leningrad, of which I have only just a couple. This one girl who, as she starved to death, kept a death diary of what she was going through. The images that come out of the Siege of Leningrad are absolutely atrocious. If you were in the Siege of Leningrad, what could you do? Eat grass, bark off a tree, or something like this. It got awful. Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister of Nazi Germany, proclaimed in the fall of 41 that the war in the East is all but over. And it really felt like that. It was a scary time. Fascism is winning, guys. And this is October of 41. The United States of America hasn't even begun to fight in World War II. Pearl Harbor is not going to happen for another couple months after this. We're still thinking we can keep out of this whole conflict. Goebbels proclaims Hitler to be a military genius. And it's actually amazing, I think, at this point that the Nazis will lose. And in less than 4 years. 4 long years. By December 1941, the Nazis have gained more ground in less time than any other army in history. Of course, their use of military technology has enabled this greatly. Now, out of the horror of the Siege of Leningrad, there is a truly heroic and amazing thing that happened. One of the greatest musicians of all time ever is Dmitri Shostakovich. Shostakovich claims Leningrad as his hometown, but when the Nazis came, he was able to flee. As a musician, he really didn't think there was any other way that he could fight other than by composing music. So he composed an epic 7th symphony. This symphony is a very long symphony, and it's both dark with a lot of gloomy feeling in it, and then it has a driving passion in it as well. He composes this symphony for the Leningrad Symphony Orchestra. The music, the sheet music, was literally airlifted into Leningrad. Much of the Leningrad Symphony Orchestra had starved to death. The rest were on the verge of starvation. They could barely play. Other people who weren't professional musicians but who felt they could maybe play the parts helped out. A free performance was scheduled. Radios broadcast it all throughout the city. Of the musicians that had died, their chairs were left empty except for their instrument, which was placed there. Guys, this had to be one of the most incredible musical performances of all time, ever. People who could barely walk came to it. They cried and they were inspired. It was, of course, recorded and played for the troops in the Red Army. The Seventh Symphony was one of the greatest works of music to come out of the Second World War. It wasn't just the Nazis that thought they were going to win. Stalin thought they were going to win too and actually sued for peace in 1941. Hitler, of course, didn't respond. That information wasn't released to the Russian public until after the collapse of communism in the 1990s. Gregory Zhukov asked Stalin for 90,000 men to defend Moscow. Moscow was the second city that the Nazis wanted to take, the second of three cities. The Nazis got within 30 miles of Moscow. Sounds just like the Germans with Paris during the First World War. Close enough they could hit Moscow. Today, if you go to Moscow and you go to the subway, you'll find that the Moscow subway is deep, deep, deep underground. This was a response to the Great Patriotic War. In case Moscow ever gets bombed again, you have someplace safe to go. But this didn't exist in the 1940s. So what did most of the people in Moscow do? Well, they tried to run away, flee east, go to the Ural Mountains. Shopkeepers opened up their store. Hey, take anything you want before the Germans get here. And what about Stalin? Stalin himself considers going into the Ural Mountains. Essentially, the Soviets are ready to give up. And then Stalin and the Soviet Red Army, they decide not to retreat into the Ural Mountains. They decided Moscow is where they're going to make their stand. But it's going to come at a high price. The order goes out that there are no longer any non-combatant civilians. Everybody is expected to fight. Nobody is allowed to flee. So the Soviets employ their NKVD police force to stop anybody trying to leave Moscow and to shoot them dead. And shoot them dead they did. 8,000 Soviets were killed by their own military when they were suspected of trying to leave Moscow to save their own lives. When one family refused to stop their car or get out of their car when the NKVD stopped them, the NKVD simply rolled over the car, crushing the people inside. But one of the greatest things that ever happened to the Soviet Union, just like when Napoleon attempted to attack and take over Russia in 1812, Stalin used what he called his greatest general, General Winter. The Russian winter is harsh. It decimated Napoleon's army, and it'll do the same to the Nazis. So the Nazi commanders, such as Heinz Guderian, this individual, this is the same guy who came up with the Blitzkrieg, he said, our men are not equipped for this. They weren't planning, they didn't have the equipment for fighting in the winter. They thought they'd be in Moscow by now. So let's pull back and regroup. Let's pull back and regroup because we can't get resources to them quick enough. Now, here's where Hitler could have been rational. Listen to this military genius, Heinz Guderian, and say, okay, Guderian, great idea. We'll retreat a little bit, get our army re-equipped, attack in the springtime, take Moscow and Leningrad and Stalingrad, which is the third city. We'll win the war. But Hitler doesn't. He simply says, nope, you're going to hold the line. You're going to keep fighting. And then he said this statement, which is kind of interesting. He tells Guderian, do you think Frederick the Great's grenadiers enjoyed dying for their country either? For Hitler, he'd rather kill his own men than see them retreat. It was a cold winter, easy to freeze to death. Commanders on both sides would have to shake their men in their foxholes to make sure that they stayed alive. As we go into 1942, we go back to Kiev. This is considered to be one of Hitler's great blunders. When the Nazi army rolled into Kiev, rolled into the Ukraine, so many of them welcomed the Germans. You are liberating us. We do not like the Soviets. 5 million Ukrainians died in the collectivization of, or during the collectivization years of the Soviet Union. So they welcome the Nazis as their liberators. But when they show up, when the Nazis show up, Hitler and his racist policies end up costing the Nazis. Here was a country that was willing to fight for the Nazis. Why wouldn't the Nazis embrace that? Well, because the Nazis are racist. So let's take a look at some quotes here. Hitler said that there is only one duty, to Germanize this country by the immigration of Germans and to look upon the natives as redskins. So obviously the Jews didn't embrace the Nazis for showing up, But the Ukrainians did, but like the Jews, many of the Ukrainians are going to be exterminated. Hitler continuing to talk about the Ukrainians. It is inconceivable that amorphous masses which contribute nothing to civilization occupy infinite tracts of soil that is one of the richest in the world. Remember that Ukraine is frequently considered to be the, quote, breadbasket of Europe. Now, the man in charge of implementing Nazi policy in the Ukraine is this guy, Erich Koch, who has this attitude: the lowliest German worker is 1,000 times more valuable than the entire population of the Ukraine. Now, interesting, Koch is actually subordinate to this other guy named Alfred Rosenberg, and Rosenberg's actually a rational guy and is not as much of a racist. He said we should work cooperatively with the Ukrainians. They want to help us. They want to support us. Koch is a subordinate to Rosenberg, actually complained to Hitler and got Rosenberg fired. Koch is in charge. Here's a nice image of a Nazi actually giving food to a Ukrainian. The Ukrainians had to learn how to survive, just like the people during the Siege of Leningrad. From the primary source documents that we have from this, it's amazing what they tried to eat. First, their pets, then rats, birds, the bark off of birch tree, and evidently jasmine leaves helps keep some of the Ukrainians alive. Awful stories of children going to beg for food from the Germans and the Germans giving them bags of human feces. The Nazis thought that was a joke. One of the things that you could try to do to survive as a Ukrainian is to identify the Jews that you knew. Here's an image of Jews digging their own graves before they get shot and fall down into them. The Nazi group that followed the Wehrmacht, the Nazi army, into these regions was the Einsatzgruppen, and they were part of the SS. And so the Nazi army, the Wehrmacht, they just go and conquer areas and keep moving on. They don't implement Hitler's racial policies. The Einsatzgruppen, they were the ones responsible for implementing the racist policies. Around 4 million Ukrainians died. About 900,000 of those were Jewish, and this is all because of Erich Koch. After the war, Koch was placed on trial for crimes against humanity, as he very well should have. And here he is, he just decided to sleep through the whole trial. He's probably the face of the banality of evil. Now here's an interesting group of people who emerged on the Eastern Front during World War II, the partisans. The partisans were individuals who were, I think, almost all men, but actually I don't know. They lived in the woods. They weren't captured by the Nazis. And they did this hit and run guerrilla warfare against the Nazis. These individuals were called the partisans. And Stalin celebrated the partisans as true patriotic heroes. It's not really who they were. They were really thugs. They'd go from house to house to house to steal your food, sometimes hurt you. It didn't matter who you were. You could be just as anti-Nazi as them. Their goal is survival. Now, if one of these guys did capture the Nazis, they just shoot them. There's nothing else they could do with them. If the Nazis captured a partisan, then the partisan would be tortured. And like I said, Stalin really celebrated these guys, but really they were nothing much more than thugs. Continuing on with the brutality of the Eastern Front, when the Nazis found out that the partisans had mined the roads, they would capture Slavic children and they'd have the children march in front of the army so that the children would blow up, save Nazi lives. Many people had predicted that the war on the Eastern Front wouldn't even stretch into 1942, and it almost didn't. Hitler almost did it completely. He almost captured all of Leningrad and Moscow by the end of 1942. But General Winter intervened, and now every Soviet citizen is expected to fight. Hitler didn't listen to his generals to withdraw his forces when that might have saved more of his men, and his racist policies in places like Ukraine turned potential allies into enemies. And on the other side, the Soviet people are going to face either the guns of the Nazis or the guns of their own army. Better to die a hero than a coward. The third city that the Nazis tried to take, and the third principal battle on the Eastern Front, is the Battle of Stalingrad, which began in 1942. This is one of the most iconic battles in all of World War II and really in all of world history. I was taught that this was the bloodiest battle of all time ever, but it seems like the numbers of the Siege of Leningrad and the numbers of the Battle of Stalingrad are fairly even. Numbers that are both too big to comprehend. Stalingrad, Stalin's city, is today the city of Volgograd because it is situated right on the Volga River. The Volga River was the end point for the Nazi army. Get to the Volga and you're done. Now, if you look at this map, Stalingrad is north of the Caucasus Mountain region. There's oil in that region. That's why Hitler wants to capture that region, and he did. The Battle of Stalingrad begins in the late summer of 1942. The Nazis take the city. The city stretches approximately 40 miles along the bank of the Volga River. Nazis captured the city and all the civilians inside. A lot of the civilians tried to hide. Where would you actually hide? A room, a closet, in a sewer system? They hid anywhere they could. Hitler's orders were to keep that city at all cost. It was the Nazi Sixth Army under the command of Friedrich Paulus. They were the ones holding the city. On the other side of the Volga River, the Soviets amassed their army, placed them on boats to shuttle them across the river to go and retake the city. This was pretty much a suicide mission. You get on the boat. There were two of you. One of you had a rifle. The person who held the rifle stood in front. You stood behind the person with the rifle, expecting that person to get shot. And then you would pick up the rifle and continue on. A lot of these boats just got blown out of the water. If that happened, you'd try to get out into the Volga River and swim for it. If you made it to the other side, then you try to attack the Nazis in this kind of 2-by-2 fashion. The expected lifespan of a Nazi soldier, as soon as he got on the boat, was 24 hours. How did the Soviets expect to win this? Very simple. Numbers, numbers, numbers. We're going to flood to the other side. We're going to flood the Nazis with humans. And sure enough, some of the Soviets got over there. And so when the Soviets got over there, then it turns into a brutal type of warfare. Street fighting. Homes are going to be retaken one by one. Buildings one by one. One of the most valuable types of soldiers in this conflict was a sniper. Great snipers would sit there for long periods of time looking at a building filled with the enemy, wait for a head to pop up, and then pop. The great heroes of the Battle of Stalingrad tended to be the snipers. And there's a lot of sniper stories from the Battle of Stalingrad. There were also whole battles that took place around the city and underneath the city in the sewage system. So hopefully you're getting a sense of how the Battle of Stalingrad is one of the most iconic and fascinating battles of the entire war and really in all of world history. Another image from the Battle of Stalingrad, another image of the street fighting in the Battle of Stalingrad. The Nazis ran out of supplies. As 42 rolled into 43, a lot of Nazis started starving. They also ran out of medical supplies. It was very scary. General Paulus of the Nazi Sixth Army wanted to retreat. But here was the situation for everybody in both armies. Nobody was allowed to retreat. This was going to be a fight to the death. Hitler issued his statement to General Paulus that capitulation is impossible. The Sixth Army will do its historic duty at Stalingrad until the last man, the last bullet. Hitler also promoted Paulus to general or field marshal, which is the highest commanding rank in German history, because he knew that no field marshal had ever surrendered in German history. So he was expecting Paulus to essentially commit suicide or die fighting. But that's not what Paulus did. Paulus surrendered in February. His men were starving. His men were wounded without medical supplies. And this is considered to be the turning point of World War II. At the same time that the Americans and the British had just gotten done capturing North Africa, they hadn't even begun to attack Southern or Western Europe yet. The Soviets, the Red Army and citizens alike have turned the tide of this war. The Nazis are finally on the defensive. Their army has been worn down. Here come the Soviets, and the Soviets are going to strike back with a brutal vengeance. Now, if you remember, the Soviets had spent a lot of time during the late 1920s and 1930s placing people in gulags in Siberia and such. Well, they gave these prisoners an opportunity to fight for their country. So, released from prisons, these Soviet penal battalions, or Strafsbats as they were called, would be issued fake guns, literally these wooden sticks in the shape of guns. And they would be expected to march on the front lines. They would naturally be fired upon, exposing the Nazi positions, then allowing the real army to strike back at those Nazis. They called this form of fighting reconnaissance through combat. All right, back up to Leningrad. Eventually, soldiers and supplies were able to get into Leningrad. The Nazi siege of Leningrad was very effective, so how did supplies get into it? Well, Lake Ladoga, here it is. Take a look at the dotted line on this map. This dotted line goes over the lake because Lake Ladoga freezes. So supplies would be driven by truck over Lake Ladoga. Notice that this driver is driving with his door open. This is so in case the ice begins to crack and the truck goes down, you might have an opportunity to jump out to save your own life. And that is how the Soviets won the Siege of Leningrad. From 1943 into 1945, the Soviets are on the advance, pushing the Nazis back into Germany proper. And if the Nazis had committed their own atrocity during the first half of World War II, the Soviet army is also going to commit horrible atrocities. Just like every Soviet was expected to fight, the Red Army also does not respect civilians as non-combatants. Some of the worst stories of this involve rape. For families, there was really no place to hide. Now, what's also extraordinarily bizarre is, let's say you were one of the Soviets who was captured and held in one of these huge pens, one of these huge corrals, these Nazi POW camps. Let's say you actually survived. Let's say you actually made it to 44. Here comes the Red Army. They're going to liberate you, right? Well, the Red Army identified you as a traitor because you had not died fighting against the Nazis. So you were shipped off to a Soviet prison. I sadly don't have time to talk about this, but there was a major air campaign that the British and the Americans were launching against Nazi Germany at this time. And perhaps one of the most atrocious events was the firebombing of Dresden, which happened in February of 1945. Dresden was a railroad hub, so if you were in the Nazi army and you're going to get shipped out to the Eastern Front, you would go through Dresden. So it was an appropriate area to bomb for that reason. The thing is, the Americans and the British dropped incendiary bombs and just blew up the whole town, killing a lot of civilians. And the fires were so horrible and so tremendous that they ate up all the oxygen, causing these huge windstorms. So the stories that come out of the firebombing of Dresden are absolutely just surreal. People running away from the fire, but the wind would pick them back up and suck them back into the fire. People would just be running and then pass out because there's no oxygen. There's a great story about this, but I don't have time for it. Dresden is actually a sister city of Columbus, Ohio. So we do a lot of cultural exchanges with Dresden. If you're interested in me talking about that, just let me know. I love the story of how Dresden and Columbus became sister cities. But I don't have time for it here. Hitler, spring 1945. He knows the end is near. If he was rational, you end the war. And if you take a look, he's pinning the Iron Cross on them, the equivalent of our Medal of Honor. These were the last days of Hitler. He was living in a bunker deep underground Berlin. The Nazi high command was down there with him, along with his girlfriend, Eva Braun. He and Eva got married. Within 2 weeks, they committed joint suicide. Knowing that Mussolini had been captured and executed and his body had been desecrated, he made sure that that would not happen to him. So after he and Eva Braun committed joint suicide together, some of the Nazi SS that was down in the bunker with him got their bodies, took them out of the bunker, doused them with gasoline, set a match to them, let them burn, and then covered them up. The Soviets found and documented these remains. But throughout the rest of the 20th century, there was all the suspicion that maybe Hitler got out, maybe Hitler got out. Hitler did not. He committed suicide, but not before forcing almost all of Germany to commit suicide by continuing to fight a war that there was no way they could win by 1945. But let it be known, the Soviets got to Berlin first. Here they are, standing in front of a makeshift hospital on Unter den Lindenstrasse, in front of the Brandenburg Gate, the icon of downtown Berlin, constructed in the 1790s during the waning years of Frederick the Great. And here's probably the most famous image from the spring of 1945. The Soviet army hoisting the Soviet flag on the Reichstag. Hitler was dead. The war in Europe was over. Who conquered Berlin? The Soviets conquered Berlin. The Americans and the British had been driving in from the West. The Americans and the British had liberated Western Europe, as well as Italy, as well as North Africa. If we did have the ability to take Berlin before the Soviets got there, Supreme Allied Commander Dwight David Eisenhower was unwilling to sacrifice the American lives needed to drive that fast into Nazi Germany. The Soviets, of course, never had a choice. But this is an amazing picture from 1945. The Americans meeting the Soviets. Germany at this point effectively divided between two occupying forces. The Western Allies, the Americans, the British, and the French. And on the eastern side, the Soviets. We're allies in this picture. Cooperative, united by a common enemy, the Nazis. But of course, almost as quickly as these men release their handshakes and the war ends, a new Cold War will begin between the countries of these men. This Cold War will split Europe down the middle. It's a conflict of ideology, of what type of government is the best government, what type of economic system is the best economic system, which seems just like an intellectual conflict. But both of these countries is going to see the other country as a threat. Both the United States and the Soviet Union saw the other as trying to take over the entire world. And by 1949, both of these countries is going to have an atomic bomb. And the fate of Europe will be held in the balance between the Cold War conflict between the United States of America and the Soviet Union. That's what we'll start learning about next week, Euro Bears. Have a great day.